Let me welcome all of you. Thank you for coming. Unfortunately, it's a bit of a rainy day, but thank you all, and we look forward to discussion. And I want to start by introducing Peter Eigen, who for me has all these years been a role model, somebody that I think I told this to you the last time, I have admired for many, many years. So it's a real personal privilege to have Peter here, and a wonderful pleasure to see him again and to listen to his wisdom that he has acquired over all these years. And I think it also is a very great treat for all of you to be able to interact with somebody who has had such a long career as a civil society activist, or as sometimes these gentlemen and women are called, social entrepreneurs who have fought for some very important causes all their life. You remember the slide that I showed you the last time about Peter's career? I'll be very brief with my introduction. Obviously, he had a very long career at the World Bank, and it was precisely the World Bank, at least at the time, that then got him to his new, if you will, well, the passion was always there, but trying to execute it in a different way, namely to leave the bank, and found Transparency International. Later on, he became chairman of the EITI, a multi-stakeholder partnership, which is the topic of today's session with Peter. He's currently is a member of the African Progress Panel. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. He also founded the Civil Society Center in Berlin, and teaches at numerous universities in Germany, and I believe also abroad. And I have met Peter on many occasions, mostly then when I was still in the US, in different contexts, and he has always been a great supporter of our causes, and by coming here is a great supporter of the school, and also personally of Mr. Soros, whom he knows very well, because these are obviously not easy times for us as a school, as an educational institution, and also personally for Mr. Soros, given what is happening in this country. So on that note, Peter, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for spending the morning with us. I'll hand over to you. As I said, the student prepared some questions, but you might want to start off with some more general remarks, and then after the questions, the floor is open for more questions. Okay? Thank you for coming, Peter.
Well, thank you very much. You embarrassed me with your very kind and generous introduction. In fact, I wanted to really start the other way around in telling you how much my career was affected by having worked with Wolfgang in 1999 on an assignment by Kofi Annan to see how one could try to introduce more justice, a better governance worldwide in a globalized economy, where obviously the main actors of traditional governance, national governments, have lost their reach, have lost their capacity to assert the primacy of politics over the market. At that time, I was part of a task force, and it was Wolfgang who brilliantly put together and articulated what we came up with. And I must admit that this has become a mantra of my career since this time, since about 20 years, very much reinforced by my direct and personal experiences with Transparency International, but also with other multi-stakeholder initiatives afterwards. And therefore, in many ways, being invited here, being invited by Wolfgang to speak to you, is like closing a circle after 25 years of activity in a sector which has been very exciting, but which is presently under attack and is in jeopardy. There's a second cycle which is closing that has to do with the Central European University. I have been here several times before. I admire this institution. I admire the direction, the vision, the strategy of this institution. And I would like to congratulate you for being here and trying to share the wisdom and the strength and so on, which comes from this spirit. And of course, that is a direct reference also to George Soros, who has been one of the great supporters of my various activities. And I must say, coming in from the airport, seeing the billboards on the side of the street, seeing how he is attacked, how he is in many ways humiliated by the political establishment here in Hungary is painful, and therefore I would like to understand my coming here also as a gesture of support to George, whom I greatly admire and whom I owe a lot. Well, you say that I should talk a little bit generally about myself. I will be interested in your questions and interested in your comments, and therefore I will try to keep it short, although I have to admit it's a pleasure to talk about myself, even though people say Eigen stinkt in Germany, which is a point which has to do with that if somebody praises Eigen, which is myself, that this smells very bad. My children always say Eigenlob stimmt, and that is of course much more pleasant, which again is another point which says if you praise Eigen, like Wolfgang has done, he's absolutely right. So thank you very much, Wolfgang, for doing that. Wolfgang asked me to say a few words about my motivation of being so active in this work of creating better governance, creating a better world. And it's very hard for me to articulate this, but I have to admit that I, for a very long time, I was very much driven by a sense of justice, of a Gerechtigkeitsgefühl, as we call it in Germany. And I found it rather unacceptable that there's so much poverty, so much misery, so much death and destruction worldwide, while in many ways we in Europe and in the United States and in general in the North or in the West, we are having a relatively comfortable life, and a comfortable life very much at the expense of millions, perhaps billions of people who are part of an unjust and unfair and failing global governance. And this has become sharper and sharper, this sense, as I grew older. I was probably most touched by an experience of traveling through Latin America after a Fulbright grant in Kansas, Lawrence, Kansas, where I spent a year. At that time, I had already learned how fragile the attitudes of the North are, in particular when you are in the Midwest in America. In fact, I had sort of a precursor of what many of the voters of President Trump expressed in bringing such a terrible person into the presidency in the US. So at that time, I began to doubt very much my complacency as a young man. And but then seeing in Latin America the injustice, the unfairness, brutality of the power elites in many countries. In fact, I spent quite a bit of time in Somoza's Nicaragua at the time. I spent a lot of time in Paraguay, where Stroessner was mistreating his people. I spent quite a bit of time in Argentina, which at the time had a military government. So it was, for me, a wake-up call. And when I came back to Germany and finished my PhD, my economics and my law degrees, I knew I wanted to do something to change the world, to create more justice, as I called it at the time. And therefore, I was very happy when the World Bank hired me. I was happy also because I was in the rather painful process of writing my professorial habilitation, my professorial dissertation, which I admit was painful not only because of the rather hierarchical nature and autocratic nature of universities in Germany at the time, but also because I'm not really a great scholar. I'm more an activist, somebody who has ideas on how to change things. And so I was very happy when the World Bank hired me into the legal department of the World Bank, and I stayed there for 25 years. And in fact, this made it possible for me to leave the World Bank and continue working on exactly what I wanted to do without any concern about funding, because at least funding myself, because I had a nice pension from the World Bank. So in many ways there's nothing heroic about it, but I was as you probably told your students last time, I was more or less fired by the World Bank when I began to systematically fight corruption. At that time I was the director of the World Bank office in Nairobi, in charge of Eastern Africa, and I saw how many of the governments around me, many of the sort of kleptocratic power elites of the countries around Kenya were undermining everything which we were trying to do, the World Bank was trying to do, what the international community was trying to do, and many of the good people in the government in these countries were trying to do, because they were part of a systematic arrangement for bribing, for skimming off, promoting the wrong projects at the expense of the people, at the expense of the development of the people in these countries. So this is why I wanted to do something about it with the power and with the money and the leverage of the World Bank. But the World Bank is, as you know, owned and controlled by national governments. So this lack of capacity, lack of incentive for long-term good global governance, which we observed in national governments, which you observed in national governments in your writing, Wolfgang. That was evident also in the board of the World Bank. I mean, there the Germans were important, the French, the Brits, the Japanese, the Canadians. I leave out the Americans in this context because they had, for some strange reason, under Jimmy Carter, created the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which didn't allow American citizens to bribe outside their borders in 1977. But all the others basically thought that corruption was something which was more or less given by nature, and there was no governance internationally, and since one had to operate in a globalized market, everybody had to fend for themselves. And so the Germans, for instance, allowed German companies to systematically bribe, to systematically pervert the economic management of governments, of mayors, of presidents, of ministers, of managers of parastatals, and do this with impunity. In fact, they even rewarded corrupt deals by making corruption payments explicitly tax deductible for German companies. And it was similar in most other countries, with the exception of the United States. So at that time, it was clear when I tried to develop a World Bank systemic approach to protect the people of Africa against corruption, that in the board, the representatives of these governments said this is not part of the World Bank's mandate. In fact, it is illegal. You cannot do it. You know, it is interference with the domestic policies of our partner countries, and therefore they said, if you want to do this, you have to leave the bank, and fortunately I did. But as I said, it was not a heroic sacrifice, because at the time the wall had come down in Germany in 1990, 1989, 1990. The wall had come down in Berlin, and I moved happily into a house that my late wife had inherited in Berlin, and began to work with people like Wolfgang, with people like colleagues in the World Bank, with outsiders, other development institutions, to set up an organization which would fight corruption. And I think it was all very natural, and I never really thought about why I was doing this. was partly perhaps also a bit of one-upsmanship. I was angry about my colleagues in the World Bank who continue to fight our attempts, basically telling everybody that this was highly naive, highly romantic, highly unprofessional and embarrassing that a former director of the World Bank was running around trying to fight corruption. So this is why I did this, and I think I got a lot of support. Exactly 25 years ago, in February 1993, we set up in the office of Minister Pronk, the then Minister of Development of the Netherlands, in The Hague, in his office. He invited me and I brought 7 people. That's how many people you need in order to set up an association in Germany. He got a German notary, and we created in February 1993, 25 years ago, Transparency International. The real celebration, the real launch was a bit later, was in May 1993, when we had already in Berlin a meeting of about 80 people from all over the world. And this is why we are going to celebrate this year our 25th anniversary. And what we noticed, coming back a bit to the substance of the subject, the multi-stakeholder impact on governance, we noticed that we were able, with our small NGO, which at the time had perhaps 3-4 staff members, most of us working pro bono, we were able to change in a major way the system on global corruption. The system which I described earlier, this sort of scandalous system of rich countries allowing their nationals, their companies to go out and bribe people for wrong projects, for wrong economic policies. This system was more or less a result of the fact that the national governments, including the German government, they thought there's nothing you can do about it. And same the companies. I mean, many companies, including German companies, they thought it would be much better to have a corruption-free global market because we are competitive. We can deliver good quality at good prices, reliable service, and so on. And therefore, it would be much better if there would be no corruption. But they felt they have to live up to what they consider to be the sort of chaos or the vacuum or the failing global governance and its rules. And they were both powerful sources of governance, sources of shaping the reality. They were both more or less victims of their sense of helplessness and, as you called it, lack of symmetry, asymmetry in terms of the capacity to regulate and the market within one wanted to apply regulatory authority. So we came in. We were hardly established. I didn't really know what civil society organization was. I mean, I remember when I discussed this with my colleague Jeremy Pope at the time, who had joined us from the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. I called it civic society. He said, no, it's civil society, and so on. So I didn't even know what I was doing, how to call it. And in this situation, we managed to basically change the legal system in Germany and in Europe and most of the world by bringing together government, civil society, and the private sector. We had 3 meetings at the Aspen Institute. In fact, it was interesting. We convened these meetings, but the business people didn't dare to come because they thought we would embarrass them and so on. So we had to ask a friend of ours, a friend of my wife, Gesine Schwan, Richard von Weizsäcker, who had just ended his presidency in Germany, to chair the meeting. And so he came and he protected the poor people from Siemens and Daimler Chrysler and Lufthansa and so on against the onslaught of this powerful civil society movement. And in this meeting, in 3 subsequent meetings, we managed to convince them that they should help us to fight corruption. And they wrote at the end an open letter to the Kohl government, to the Minister of Economy, and said, please join us in an attempt in Paris at the OECD, where the ministers of the OECD member countries are trying to develop a standard against foreign bribery. The Germans have been extremely reluctant to get involved because they knew it is embarrassing to admit that they are bribing internationally. But based on this letter, which was signed by 20 business leaders, including the CEO of Siemens and so on, the Germans began to join, and the Germans therefore give an example to other rich countries like the French, the Japanese, the Brits, to join this very, very important OECD Convention Against Foreign Bribery, which was signed in 1997, 4 years after we started our work. And I think it was this little group of 10 people, which we were at the time, which was able to move the powerful business community of Germany to basically permit the government to join the OECD Convention. And without that, by the way, the French would have never signed, the Brits wouldn't have signed, and the Americans were, of course, very happy because they felt already constrained in the international competition because they were not allowed under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act to bribe. So it was one of the great examples of the power of this interaction, which I like to call the magical triangle of good governance: government, civil society, and private sector. And this has become, for me, a guideline for many other things which I did. I know that you want to talk about the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. After setting up Transparency International, after running it for 12 years, I then turned to one of the most corrupt and one of the most difficult sectors of the international economy, that is extractive industries, oil, gas, mining, a sector where the investments, for instance, of large international companies are huge. I mean, imagine if you go to Equatorial Guinea, and in the waters of Equatorial Guinea you begin drilling, you build some drilling platforms and so on. It's billions of dollars, which you basically put into the hands of hardly literate leaders like President Macias at the time and now President Gemma. So therefore the temptation for a investor from the US, from Germany, to buy the government, a very often underpaid government with very little security, with very little sense of responsibility to their own people, to buy them and pay them a couple of $1 million on a Swiss bank account was tremendous. And of course the temptation of the ministers, of the political leaders, the power elite in these countries to accept this money was overwhelming. And therefore, for us it was quite clear that the extractive industry transparency was one of the hardest nuts to crack. And we knew we needed a different approach from our normal Transparency International approach, which simply tried to build up civil society in the countries which are affected by corruption, give them the tools, support them through international activities, and let them basically design anti-corruption programs and try to make sure that they are able to translate this into reality. So that is our normal approach in a rather holistic sense, not only looking at criminal penalties and so on, but also the whole basket of integrity elements which normally are in place in a society to fight corruption. So this approach, which worked very well in general in many parts of the world, and therefore we very quickly built up our national chapters worldwide, and they did the work in the trenches. But this was not possible in the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, which arose out of the sense that we need a special approach. And that approach was very slow, was very cautious, was very narrow in terms of the mandate that we sought. It started all with an attempt to find out how much money mining companies are paying to their host governments. Because in most host governments, in particular in Africa, this was kept secret. I remember a conversation with President Eigen I was in charge of Cameroon when I was in the World Bank. So I talked to Mr. Eigen, and he said, we never can allow anybody to know how much money we get from the oil companies. And I said, why not, Your Excellency? And he said, well, if my ministers find out how much money I get, then they want the money. And I said, so what do they want it for? He said, oh, they want to build streets, they want to build hospitals, they want to build schools. I said, oh, this is exactly what that money is for. They said, oh, you don't understand, typical Western technocrat, from Washington, you have no idea about the reality of Africa. No, we have to keep that secret, and then I can decide what we do with the money. And therefore, in most of the resource-rich countries, even the parliaments didn't know how much money was being made by their power structure. I mean, in Nigeria, for instance, does anybody have a sense how much they make in terms of oil and gas development, in taxes and royalties and signature bonuses and dividends? Any guess, anybody? Where are you from?
I'm from Uganda.
Uganda, so you don't know what the Nigerians make. But what do you guess? Is it 100 million or 500 million?
Like 600 million US dollars?
It's $54 billion. Not million, $54 billion every year. And the parliament doesn't know anything about it. It's not in the governmental budget. I mean, now they do, because they joined the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Huge amounts of money. I mean, more than the whole World Bank lending program, more than the whole ODA for Africa. And just in the pockets of a power structure, and they share it between the central bank, the national oil company in Nigeria, the ministers in charge, and buy luxury apartments in London, and so on, and luxury cars in the case of the son of President Ngema in Equatorial Guinea. So it's an amazing amount of money which is in the hands of the power elites in these countries. And it's not only in Nigeria, it's the same in Angola, as we find out right now. It's the same in Democratic Republic of Congo, but it's also the same in many other countries, in particular in the Arab world and so on. And therefore the idea of publicizing what is being paid to the host governments was a very important step in creating better governance. And of course the government would say, we publish what we get. The companies say, oh, you just have to look at our financial statements of Exxon or Chevron or Shell and so on, and then you can find out how much we have to pay in taxes in these countries. But in reality, this was unknown to the people, and therefore in the political arena in these countries, this was not part of a building block for better governance, for holding the government accountable for these huge amounts of money which they made, while they kept, say in the case of Nigeria, about 180 million people in poverty. More than half of the Nigerian people live below the poverty line. So it is outrageous, and we tried, therefore, to simply convince President Eigen or presidents of Angola or presidents of Egypt or other countries to publish what they pay to their host governments. And the interesting thing was that this was accepted by some of the companies, partly because they were afraid of the Chinese coming into Africa and competing with them for business in Africa. And therefore some companies, including Shell, for instance, BP, they said, we will publish what we pay. But I heard from Lord Young, the CEO of BP, when he actually published a $110 million signing bonus which he had paid to the government in Angola. The Angolan government threatened to cancel their production rights because they said, you have a confidentiality clause in your concessions agreements, and when you break that, then you are out. So basically we felt that this big campaign which had been started in London, which was called Publish What You Pay initiative, we thought this was dead. But then came President Obasanjo from Nigeria. He came to Berlin. He gave a speech at the 10th anniversary of Transparency International. He had been one of the co-founders of Transparency International as the head of the African Leadership Forum, another civil society organization. And he announced in the university, in the Freie Universität, in the Auditorium Maximum, that they in Nigeria, he was president at the time, they would not only allow the companies to publish what they pay to Nigeria, but they would even make it mandatory, and the government would publish what they receive. And that was basically the birth of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, because that broke the ice. And again, that was 2003, which is exactly 15 years ago. So we can celebrate the 15th birthday of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Now this initiative was based on, first on my belief in this magical triangle of good governance, which I mentioned to you earlier, but also on a very cautious approach about how much you can ask these stakeholders to disclose in their meetings with national multi-stakeholder working groups. There was a very big multi-stakeholder working group in Nigeria of 30 people. I participated in some of their sessions. And of course it is not easy for a company to disclose exactly how much money you make, to disclose exactly how much taxes you pay and where, to disclose what your personnel policies are, whether you allow local people to take management positions, how much you do in terms of local processing. In Nigeria, you have this paradoxon that they are one of the richest oil producers in Africa or of the world, but you cannot get, very often you cannot get gasoline or kerosene for the poor people, for their kerosene lamps and so on, because they don't have any local processing. Everything is sold internationally, and the money is to some extent stolen by the local power elite. So the approach which I insisted on at the time, very often criticized by other civil society leaders, was let's go very, very cautiously and let's not demand too much from the government or private sector. And also civil society should be somewhat moderate in their demands. And it was this sort of balancing act which was extremely important when the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative was founded. And in fact, some of you may know that this is exactly the issue which is right now undermining some of the effectiveness of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Because when I left the chair of EITI in 2010, there was grumbling. There was grumbling, for instance, in the private sector, that I had been too positive about the DoddFrank Act. I mean, they felt that I should have been neutral. I should not have supported the DoddFrank Act. In fact, they claimed that the DoddFrank Act in the United States was undermining EITI because it made it mandatory to report, while the great virtue of EITI was that it was voluntary and to some extent subject to the discretion of the members of the board how far one would go. So on the open stage in Paris at my farewell event, I was told by the CEO of Shell that if I continue to support the Dodd-Frank Act, that they will not come to the next meeting. With other words, that this multi-stakeholder process would be destroyed by the companies. And as you know, I mean, from the American companies who later sued the SEC to overcome the ordinance ordinances which had been issued by the SEC in the United States by going to court and to some extent succeeded in destroying, at that time already, EITI. And right now, of course, the government is doing everything under President Trump to get rid of it. This was a first ominous sign of that we had been asking too much from the companies. I mean, we were not the DoddFrank Act, but the DoddFrank Act had basically taken our standards and carried them further by demanding country-by-country reporting, project-by-project reporting, which we as EITI had not asked. So it is very interesting that the companies began grumbling at the end of my term, but then came in Claire Short, a very strong politician from London, who was not as cautious as I was, and I was very proud of how she moved on and demanded much more delivery for EITI than I had dared to do, which I thought in the beginning I had to be particularly careful. But he asked, for instance, for publication of concessions agreements, which in many participating countries were kept secret. She asked for explanations about the usefulness and of, for instance, infrastructure which was being built by operators in the mining sector or in the oil sector. Very often operators prefer captive infrastructure where they don't allow any other transport on the railway. They build a pipeline and they don't really care what that means for, say, the Maasai and their herds being driven across northern Kenya and so on. So it is very good what Claire Short then managed to get out of this multi-stakeholder process. Right now, Claire Short has been succeeded by the former Prime Minister of Sweden. But right now, there are very serious issues of some of the participants, some of the shareholders not continuing, and they had a big row in Peru in one of their last membership meetings, where in particular also issues of the legitimacy of the Publish What You Play coalition in determining who is representing civil society have come up. So EITI is a fragile instrument. It has grown to 55 participating countries. It has grown to a very important criterion for many investors, for instance, who are interested in socially acceptable investment. It has grown to an important standard for development agencies. So in many ways, this was a useful experience, but it also teaches us that one has to be extremely careful and not demand too much. I see that you are moving with your paper, so probably I'm spending too much time in discussing the virtues of this. Let me just say a few words so that we include this also in our conversation later. Because I'm now trying to apply this in other areas. I'm now trying to apply this multi-stakeholder process in transparency initiatives in sectors which are particularly poorly governed and which are particularly vulnerable to corruption, to mismanagement. And one of the things which has been going very well is a new fisheries transparency initiative, which we founded in April last year. Fisheries was considered a candidate for being included in the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, but we felt it was too distinct in terms of the actors, and therefore it was not included. And we now, maybe under the leadership of Mauritania, I should say, we have created an organization which includes Indonesia, which includes a couple of countries in Latin America and 5 African countries. We are trying to do the same thing in off-grid electricity access in Africa, where right now we are starting in the SADC countries, the Southern African countries, Malawi, Zambia, and Mozambique to improve governance, to give better access and more stability to governance in areas where off-grid electricity would be very helpful to overcome the lack of access of millions of Africans to electricity. I've been working hard to get my feet into the textile sector after Rana Plaza in this big accident in Bangladesh. I got together with Mohamed Yunus and business people in Germany to create again a multi-stakeholder process to improve governance, to protect textile workers, not only in Bangladesh but also in many countries, including some in Africa. There I have good contacts in Lesotho, which is producing textiles for the South African market, and my contact in Ethiopia is relatively difficult because they are rather skeptical about advice from others. So we are trying to use this. A colleague of mine is promoting this idea in the construction sector and procurement sector. He has organized something which is called the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative, COST, which has its headquarters in Addis, and is doing quite well. It's again supported by DFID. I should say EITI was very much supported by DFID. It was very much supported by George Soros. I remember he called me in 2001 and said, don't you know anybody in Germany who would support this? And so I called a number of people in the German government, but they all were too shy to get involved in this sector. So it was largely George Soros himself with the Open Society Institute and DFID under Tony Blair at the time, and to some extent Claire Short, who had just left the government because of the attack of London on Iraq. And they basically supported EITI. I can tell you more about how this worked and so on, but I don't want to take advantage of your patience, in particular of Wolfgang's patience, too long. So this is basically what has been my life during the last 25 years. It has taught me that multi-stakeholder approaches are extremely useful, not only in terms of creating multi-stakeholder organizations to address issues in a particular sector, but also as an approach which we are using, for instance, in a new organization which is called the Humboldt-Viadrina Governance Platform, which is called Trialoge, where we bring together government, civil society and private sector in order to discuss major policy issues in banking and energy and family policies and so on. And in fact, I should say that my wife, Gesine Schwan, has invented that and basically is using this approach in order to address major policy issues in Germany and Europe in order to improve governance. So I feel this is a rather important approach. It is not yet perfect, in particular at the time when civil society organizations are under pressure, not only in Hungary, but also in other countries. In Ethiopia, for instance, in Ethiopia I wanted to join the EITI. I had long discussions at the time with the Prime Minister, with Meles Zenawi. I convinced him, he applied, wanted to become a member. But the civil society representatives on my board, mainly Global Witness, they said no, they can't join because they don't give enough space to civil society. If somebody criticizes the government, they put them in jail. And therefore, Ethiopia was not accepted for a long time. And they had to go through a number of reforms before Ethiopia was finally accepted. So this whole question on how civil society organizations can be structured to maintain their independence, but at the same time are respected by the other actors, by the private sector, by government, how they can gradually improve governance worldwide, but also at every level of governance, all the way down to local communities. This is something which you, Wolfgang, and many people still have to address, and I hope that many of you will be able to contribute to this, because it is work in progress, and it's not yet perfect, and it's risky to do it, but it is exciting and very meaningful. So in that sense, I'm very happy to convey this to you, and hope I can convince some of you how useful was the report which Wolfgang Reinicke wrote in 1999 for Kofi Annan, when he said there are three asymmetries which make it difficult for national government to play the key role in creating good global governance. One has to do with global reach of national governments, which is limited. The other one has to do with the time horizon of the decision makers in national governments, which is short term, goes from one election period to the next, in particular in democracies. And third, asymmetry is the constituency of good governance. And therefore national governments have to cater to their electors, to their voters, to their interest groups, which are not the same as the millions and millions of people who are suffering from war and destruction and poverty and misery and hopelessness in many parts of the world.
Thank you, Peter. The reason why I pulled out the paper is because we were beginning to answer all the questions. So and in some ways you did, but let's go through them anyway. As you said, there is so much more to say about this, and as you heard, we could go on this. You can have an entire course on this and more. And I think it's also fantastic to hear that you're starting these new initiatives. In fact, there's a question indirectly on that. I can see already all kinds of wonderful applied policy projects in fisheries or off-grid electricity and so on and so forth. So maybe the school and the students can in some way even get involved in this in some form. But why don't I hand over to you guys now, and you worked very hard to develop a few questions. Hopefully we get through them so that we can have a more open floor. As I said to you, and as I said to you, Peter, and I'm grateful that you made that comment, the private sector is the elephant in the room that few people talk about, that few people write about. I think it's very important to talk about it. How tough are you? How tough can you be? And how gentle are you? It's always a very tight line to walk, and you easily overstep. And again, learning from you and hearing from you, the management of these networks is key to success. They're very difficult. They're a lot more fun than sitting in a bureaucracy, I can guarantee you that. And you meet a lot more interesting people, but they're extremely difficult to manage successfully. And there aren't that many successful incidences, at least the ones that I know at the global level. Nevertheless, they hopefully are a promising tool. So can I turn over to you guys? I think you're well organized, and start with the first question. Maybe you just introduce you briefly yourself and say where you're from, and then we'll work through these questions. Do we need the mic, or can you hear us all pretty well? You can speak up and.
My name is Katja. I'm from Georgia. Thank you so much for sharing real experience with that. Last class we looked at ETI work from different angles, and my group was looking at ETI collaboration and cooperation with civil society organizations, how to engage them more. We reviewed several studies and several reports, and my question came to me from one report which stated the importance of citizens' engagement as a vital for EITI future work, successful work.
I didn't understand the further.
Citizen engagement.
Citizen engagement.
Right.
And the report suggested that, for instance, the widening of the scope of reporting of EDI and encouraging input from citizens could be the ways how to make more citizens more engaged. But it's really interesting to
opinion, which other avenues would foster the citizens' participation in resource governance under the global governance mechanism of EITI? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think this is a very important question, because the reporting of the numbers is not the goal, the objective of the whole exercise. The use of these numbers, of credible information about the most important elements of good governance by the people is the objective. And therefore at EITI we did not only have, I should say we did, because I'm not there anymore, we did not only have the interest in having the reports themselves validated by international objective consultants, but also the process of disseminating these reports and making sure that they are made accessible to the media, to civil society organizations, to society in general. And I think this has become extremely successful. I mean, I remember once I went in Liberia. I went from Monrovia up north to the Bong mines, and on the way we saw at least 3 times huge billboards which publicized the numbers of the payments which had been made by the iron ore, by the rubber plantations, by the forestry concessions to the governments. When we were at the Bong mine in the north, there was an audience perhaps 3 times the size of this one, and some of them were traditional leaders, were chiefs of the local area, of the local groups, were workers from the mining company and the iron ore mines, were villagers. And at that time there was a difference of opinion between the numbers which had been given by the government about how much money they received and the claims of the companies, what they have paid to the government. There were a couple of $1 million were missing. And it was right there where the government was forced to basically admit that the money had been stolen, money had been misreported. And right there, the audience was very, very excited and insisted that there should be an attempt of the government of recovering this money from corrupt civil servants. In fact, outside the room in which we were talking was the whole village was assembled. There were about, I would say, about 500 people. So that was a case where very quickly it became clear that there was no credible numbers about the payments of the mine to the people. Therefore, they couldn't do anything about it, and there were some remedies for misreporting. Now in Nigeria, we found billions of dollars missing. In fact, our former colleague Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who was the Minister of Finance, she said $26 billion were missing. The government at the time, Goodluck Jonathan, they said no, it's only $6 billion which is missing. The governor of the central bank said it's $12 billion which is missing. And the minister lost her job in this process because the government was so angry that she mentioned this huge amount of money, $26 billion. So to bring these data into the public was extremely important. And I remember in Colombia, for instance, they had, near the mines in the villages, they had billboards in which the numbers were shown of what had been paid by the mining company to the local government and to the central government. So this is a very important question. The information has to be brought into the political arena, into the parliament, into the media, into civil society, so that they can hold their authorities accountable. And I should say that even the companies at the time were very happy about it, because they felt that they themselves were giving the right data to various people, but nobody believed them, because they thought companies are lying, they're overstating their social responsibility. And of course people think civil society is lying because they want to have dramatic impact with their statements, and governments are lying, so everybody is lying. So it is this sort of process of deliberation, which in Germany has been mentioned as one of the elements of governance, the deliberative democracy. Habermas finds this extremely important. And in fact, I think what is happening in Germany right now, if you allow me this little footnote, is giving more emphasis to deliberation, to fighting, to discussing inside government, inside political parties, inside coalitions, and so on. So this is something which we make possible through creating multi-stakeholder working groups where everybody with their own perspective presents their numbers and their perception of what is happening on the various elements of sound mining, for instance. And then, of course, this is presented to the society, and it will only have an impact if that presentation is wide and effective and is understood by the Reinicke on the street.
Okay, thank you. There was another question, I think, on civil society. Thank you.
First off, thanks for joining us. My name's Ian and I'm from the United States. And
Is that on? That's our microphone. Is that on?
No. It's at the bottom, the switch. Yeah. It should be on.
Okay, so thank you for joining us. My name's Ian, I'm from the United States, and I have another question about civil society that you actually already started to touch on. And the question is, what measures has EITI adopted, or what measures is EITI considering adopting to improve the safety settings for civil society organizations operating in authoritarian countries?
Yeah, that's a very tough question, because we don't have cannon bolts, we don't have machine guns. We are not armed by Mr. Trump to protect civil society activists. We can only operate through our networks. Transparency International is probably more advanced than EITI, because we have, over the 25 years, built up a system, in particular also using the advisory council, which I still chair of Transparency International, where we have former presidents, where we have powerful people in various parts of the world whom we can approach if civil society is harassed. Is there a funny noise? Is there a noise when is that okay? So we had cases, of course, where people say of Transparency International have been harassed, have been put in jail, have been killed. I mean, we had a person in Rwanda who was investigating corruption in the police, and on his way home from office, a policeman came and shot him. So I mean, we cannot guarantee the safety, but we are part of networks which are, in my opinion, as effective as they can be. So when people say of Global Witness have been arrested in Angola, we motivated them and got them out very quickly. In fact, Obasanjo himself was in jail for a long time. He was at the time the chair of the advisory council. And of course, Sani Abacha, the rather cruel dictator in Nigeria, he put him in jail. And so in his case, we had a lot of activities to keep the memory of this man alive. I remember I was chairing a big meeting in Peru, and at that time there were about 5 people from Nigeria representing the government of Abacha. They were sitting in the first row in Peru, and I made everybody get up to a minute of silence to remember Obasanjo, who was held in jail. So we had activities like that, and they all got up, and they were very embarrassed, and they had to observe the minute of silence in Lima at our International Anti-Corruption Conference. So we had demonstrations to try to protect him, but it is a tough issue, in particular if legislation is passed which is an obstacle. I mean, like for instance, the Duma did in Russia a couple of years ago, and it's happening in this country. So what can we do? We can try to mobilize the international community, but we still see that journalists who are fighting corruption or activists fighting corruption, that they are killed, that they are arrested. We have given posthumous awards to journalists who have been killed for fighting corruption. But we don't have any concrete tools to really protect civil society. So it will be a relatively risky enterprise, in particular in violent and dictatorial countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. We have at Transparency International a person who is in charge of this, who has a lot of connections also with Secret Service in various parts of the world. And if we hear of cases of harassment and of intimidation and so on, or even killing, we get involved very quickly and try to raise awareness of the world to protect these people. The World Bank itself was very helpful in many ways. I mean, they also try to use their lending programs to stop lending to countries where civil society was harassed. But it is a very tough issue. And what happened in Ethiopia when they tried to join EITI, in my opinion, was one of the first steps towards liberalization, which we can observe right now. But I wonder whether you have ideas on what I can do. I mean, we cannot go to Mr. Putin and ask them to stop labeling civil society organizations as foreign agents or something like that. I mean, he is supported in this by his legislative body, by perhaps many people on the street who don't really believe in civil society activities.
Thank you, Peter. Very, very difficult, of course. Can I ask for the mic to be passed on? Thank you.
Hi, thank you. My name is Emily North. I'm also from the United States. Thank you again for being with us. Can you hear me? My name is Emily. I'm from the United States. Thank you for being with us here today and sharing your experience with us. My question is about China and the United States and the relationship they have with the EITI. So China is often criticized as being aggressive with its foreign direct investment in terms of oil extraction abroad. However, we've also seen that China is increasingly looking to appear to be a responsible international stakeholder. So my question is, how will the United States leaving EITI as an implementing partner affect China's engagement with EITI, if at all? Thank you.
Well, I have to admit that I'm not completely up to date on how the board is dealing with this issue in EITI. I mean, generally it should have no effect at all. I mean, we are very happy that the United States was active, that they passed the DoddFrank Act, that they went further in mandatory requirements. For me, it was personally very disappointing because I visited Houston and I had a wonderful conversation with the CEO of Exxon, who is now, of course, the Foreign Secretary, Secretary of State in the United States. And I feel that his example should be a warning to many of us that they try to use civil society activities in order to stave off tougher regulation. And I think many of the oil companies in the United States, they were quite happy to join us because they felt that they have a lot of influence in shaping the standards which we would establish. In particular, when I was there, and I was always cautioning to be patient and not to demand too much from companies and from others. When then the DoddFrank Act was put in place, and suddenly they were supposed to report about each operation, which of course means that you cannot offset losses in one oil well against excessive profits, which might have triggered higher levels of royalties or taxes. You cannot offset that quietly without notifying it, or you cannot offset if you have in one country tremendous losses because you don't find anything when you are exploring for minerals, while in the neighboring country you have a tremendous bonanza, which means very high dividends, high taxes, high royalties, in many cases under the structure of the concessions agreements. So suddenly they felt that the standards of the DoddFrank Act would be too bothersome, and therefore, as we know now, they did everything in order to undermine the capacity of the Security and Exchange Commission in the United States to fully implement the DoddFrank Act, which had been on its way in many companies in the United States, in many good companies. So this is something which we have learned at the time. But I think China was always a very difficult client because they, of course, don't have an independent civil society which can speak up clearly vis-à-vis the government. They themselves are very much interested in fighting corruption within China, and in that sense, Transparency International always had the possibility to invite them to our international meetings. We always had big delegations from Beijing, but also from Taiwan, by the way. And we were able to set up a modicum of a national chapter, which was mainly an academic institution of Tsinghua University. But in a strict sense, China didn't really allow this multi-stakeholder process to become fully operational. And so we are very much aware of that because we feel we can have access to the important bodies in the political party and the government. We can support them. We can support the president's campaign against corruption in China, which we think is of course a useful thing. We don't believe in capital punishment, but we believe in strong measures against corrupt leaders, and in that sense we welcome this. But it's very hard to actually convince the authorities in China to rein in corrupt operators in Africa. I mean, they tell me when I go there, they tell me, look, I mean, we never allowed our citizens to bribe in other countries, but you did, the Germans, you know. Who are you to give us a lecture? And so in Beijing, you get a very enlightened conversation going, and we have been there several times, even after I left the EITI. But they are very slow in basically stopping Chinese operators in Africa. And of course our friends in African governments who have decided to fight corruption, they also are not easily stopped from reverting back to the old ways when huge projects are offered to them. So the Chinese role is a very complicated one. I mean, basically I welcome their greater presence in Africa, but they are very hard to manage. Now, what does the absence of America mean? I mean, if indeed Trump begins a trade war with China right now, if Trump is becoming a protectionist, if he begins to handicap civil society in America, which was one of the front runners of a powerful civil society participation in governance, then maybe the Chinese will see this as a chance to become a leader for an open and free and liberal international economy, and maybe it may even have a positive impact on the Chinese. I don't know, but generally I think that right now the Americans have stopped supporting the multi-stakeholder working group in the United States, and in particular the State Department, of course. And the fact that they may not want to live up to the standards which they have helped to create has a tremendous impact on American companies, but not so much on Chinese participants.
Okay, thanks. Can we have the next question right here?
You can hear me. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Elisabetta. I'm from Romania, and you already received a lot of questions about the role of civil society. My question relates more to the role of the state. And you stated earlier that the civil society doesn't have cannonballs or machine guns to fight against oppressive regimes. And my question is built in the line of why does the civil society actually need cannonballs and machine guns to fight these regimes? So, in relation to the World Bank, along to its ideological framework of the Washington Consensus, the World Bank aims to tame and redefine the role of the state. However, when it comes to weak states with strong resources, how did this mandate change, if it did? And did the World Bank, with its advocacy of small governments, somehow strengthen the resource curse by not allowing the state to build up a solid internal capacity to govern, oversee, and monitor the private sector? And I'm asking this question in the light of Hannah Arendt's statement that says that the weakest regimes are often the most oppressive regimes. Thank you.
Did you understand the last thing? What did the World Bank state?
Well, I think the basic idea is, if I can translate, is that given that the bank often supports a rather small state, let's put it this way, a weak state, aren't they indirectly complicit in the sense of supporting the resource curse in some ways, at least in the early days, in your days, because the state simply doesn't have the capacity to operationalize an idea like EITI? Is that?
Oh yeah, thank you very much. I mean, this is indeed an excellent question. I'm sorry I didn't acoustically understand it very well. You have exactly the same pitch as my tinnitus, by the way, and so you are competing for attention with my tinnitus. But I think the idea of the World Bank to limit the impact of governments on the economy was very much caused by the reality that after independence, many African states, for instance, did not have any private sector. So whatever anybody wanted to do, whether I want to build a shoe fabric or a bakery or whatever, it had to be done by the state. And therefore in many African states, but also in some other developing areas, the governments were practically doing everything. And what the World Bank therefore very often tried to do was to separate things which are most suitable for commercial activities, and therefore privatize. I mean, this is a dirty word, privatize, in my books, but this is what we tried to do at the time. But this is quite different from arguing for a weak state. In fact, a state which does not lose its energies and so on in becoming a producer of bread or of flour or of shoes or of dresses and so on, is has more resources to use to govern. I mean, the World Bank never really wanted to undermine the capacity of states to govern. They just try to get rid of those things which are in more developed countries handled by the private sector. So this is something which one has to distinguish from sort of the neoliberal gospel of trying to get the state out of the way of the private sector, which is a rather different matter, which in my opinion is a harmful approach, because the state, in my opinion, has the responsibility to interfere with the market, to regulate the market. I believe in what we in Germany call soziale Marktwirtschaft, social market economy, which means, yes, the market is in charge of the basic allocation of resources and so on. But it's a social market, which means it is a market that is regulated by society. And if the market doesn't function, for instance, because of corruption or because of monopolies and so on, then the government has to intervene to correct this malfunctioning. But a malfunctioning can also be if the market weakens the poor, if the market creates imbalances. Martin Luther once said, the devil shits on the biggest heap. And this is really a fantastic sort of mantra for understanding capitalism. Once you are powerful, once you are strong, you get more and more powerful and stronger and stronger. And this is why social market economy means that you protect the weak, you protect the poor. You allow labor unions, for instance, to protest against exploitation. You help people in society who are underprivileged, who are handicapped. And this capacity to correct the outcome of the market is extremely important for us, the social market economy, the soziale Marktwirtschaft. And this has been lost in a globalized economy where we rely on nation states to regulate the economy, because nation states cannot do it anymore because of these three Wolfgang asymmetries. And that is exactly where we have to strengthen the capacity of the economy, of society to regulate the market. Do I make myself understood? And this is how the World Bank, in my opinion, has been operating lately. So much so, for instance, under Jim Wolfgang, that the owners of the World Bank, the governments of the member countries, they complained to him. At one meeting they said, look, this is our bank. That's not the bank of Amnesty International or Transparency International or Global Witness. So we tell you what to do, and not the head of Amnesty International. So in a way, he got into real trouble because he was listening more to us than to the governments, who are their owners and who run in weekly meetings with the executive board all the decisions which have to be taken in order to approve projects and so on. So the World Bank, in my opinion, has learned its lesson. It probably has given the impression under the structural adjustment lending, where it was trying to correct this overexposure of the economy to the public sector, which I mentioned earlier. It has given the impression that the World Bank and the IMF are trying to weaken the state. They are not. They are trying to create a state which can effectively regulate the market. And of course, it's difficult because many people in Germany, for instance, the political parties, they are suspicious of civil society. They say, look, I mean, we have been elected, not these self-appointed leaders of civil society organizations. I mean, who gave them the mandate to tell the government what to do? And this is a continuous fight. I think in the United States, they have learned very early on, in particular when it comes to environmental issues, climate change and things of that nature. They have learned very early how important the voice of civil society is. In London, I would say there's also an enabling environment for civil society. Therefore, there is a community of powerful international NGOs. In continental Europe, we are still growing into this. I mean, I believe in Germany, we still have to learn quite a bit in order to give more voice to civil society, in order to empower governments, in order to help governments which are helpless to deal with global governance. So in a way, it's a bit paradox, but I don't think that the World Bank is trying to weaken governments. The World Bank is trying to help governments to strengthen the rule of law, to be open to civil society inputs, but also to be open to the needs of the private sector. Because the private sector basically has to be the driving motor for economic development everywhere in the world. I mean, the ODA, official development assistance, will be just a drop in the bucket in terms of the needs of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So we have to find a way to create an enabling environment for the private sector. And in the final analysis, it's the governments, the elected democratic governments, which have to be able to regulate the economy, which means in a globalized market that they need the help of civil society.
I'm glad you brought this up, because when Peter described this growing tension of international organizations, on the one hand having to serve their traditional clients, namely member countries, that's reflected in the governance structure and so on, at the same time increasingly having also interactions with civil society. Remember, we talked about the orchestration model, a very simplistic model, but nevertheless, and that's the challenge for international organizations. They live almost in a dual world, two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, the traditional interdependent world, where the major actors are nation states, and they delegate certain powers and operational aspects to international organizations, but at the same time, civil society, through these kinds of organizations, is becoming more and more involved in policy making at the global level, and therefore, by definition, interacting with the World Bank. And it's very difficult for international organizations. They find themselves right in the middle of this tension to serve two different clients. Okay, so you did this was very well, the way you put it was excellent. Thank you.
So I get a good break.
You get an excellent break. Next question.
Hi, can you hear me? My name is Yates. I'm also from the United States. And so my question is going to piggyback a lot off of what you just said about the World Bank. And it's mainly around the creation of the EGPS Multi-Donor Trust Fund in 2016, how the World Bank funds the EITI. Did this signal from the World Bank a shift to a more holistic approach to dealing with the extractive industries, in the sense that it was now viewing transparency as a slice of the whole?
Well, the World Bank has a very rigorous budgeting system. So it goes from the bottom up, small units like a division or a department or a vice presidency. They develop their budgets and they put this to the board of the World Bank, which are the representatives of the member governments. And then they are told, yes, great, 20% for agriculture, 5% for education, 25% for road construction, and so on. And the Americans would say 0 for family planning and so on. So this process is being undermined by these trust funds, because governments, say the Scandinavian countries, they will say we want to do much more to fight corruption, and therefore all we want to deal particularly with good governance in the extractive industry sector. And therefore they say we give you $35 million in a special fund which will be devoted to extractive industries. And therefore the World Bank as an institution says this is undermining the budget autonomy of the owners of the World Bank, and therefore is continuously a struggle with this attempt to for rich countries to promote their own hobby horses, which may be in some cases, say, gender equity, in other cases maybe fighting tuberculosis, or in other cases maybe building railroads, rather than streets and so on, to allowing them to shift the rather institutional budgeting process of the World Bank into their direction, and use the, in my opinion, excellent technical capacities of these 10,000 World Bankers who are sitting there trying to help the world, shift them into a direction which is different from the normal budgeting process. So this is sort of the tension which you have to keep in mind when you look at trust funds. There was a time when I was division chief in Latin America, for instance. I had a budget, I don't know for how many millions, for travel of my staff and so on, paying their salaries, and I had about double that amount from trust funds, because I went around to the Germans and to the Brits and said, hey, we have to do much more in the sector of health or something like that. So the board at some point began to stop this. They began to reduce this. I think right now they are again more open, but other donor international development banks are very restrictive on this. The Inter-American Development Bank, for instance, the Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, they don't allow major trust funds to be established. To basically, in the final analysis, you can imagine a situation where all the operations of the World Bank are funded by trust funds. And this is where the rich countries basically shift the direction of their sector work, their economic work, and their project work into a way where, for instance, African governments, which cannot pay, most of them cannot pay into trust funds, they have no say. So this is sort of the conceptual background which you have to keep in mind when you look at trust funds. Now, the trust fund in the case of the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative meant that there was a different governance over a major pot of money to do our work than for the EITI itself. I mean, the EITI itself had elected us, or the board, me as chair, to decide where to go. Now the trust fund people had their own board. They had they regularly met at the time when we had our other board meetings. I remember at one point they asked us to leave the room when the trust fund board met, and it was in the Paris office of the World Bank. And so I took my chair and went out of the room, and I was sitting right next to the door. And because I said, look, we have to be in there, we have to know what you decide, because you are using a lot of money, which we are accountable for things which we may not want. I mean, a very important example was that the World Bank wanted to include Angola, while we said Angola is too corrupt, the civil society is too weak, we don't want them, we are not going to touch them. And there are other examples like that. And so I was sitting there in front of the door, and after half an hour, one person came out, went to the toilet, somebody else went to the phone call, and so on. And they always asked, what are you doing here? I said, well, you excluded me from your meeting. And so after about an hour, somebody came out and said, by the way, we took a resolution, you are allowed to come in. So I then had observer status. But it was quite clear that these people who had donated for this trust fund, which were a couple of rich countries, they had their own discussions, their own decision making, their own voting power, which was different from my board. And it was only because of the close interaction between the staff of my secretariat and so on, and the people in the World Bank, my former colleagues, that things didn't blow up But it is a institutional inconsistency. I mean, you cannot really say we have a trust fund for something which is run by a board, which is elected by the members, but we decide what to do. And I think this was again one of these sort of balancing acts which we had in the beginning had to perform in order to survive. So the answer to your question is no, it did not make things more holistic. It was a nuisance, which we had to deal with in order to keep the money, because the trust fund was used by managers of the World Bank with their own experts to send them into our countries and to help our countries to set up, for instance, secretariats for the multi-donor, the multi-stakeholder working group. So it was extremely important for us. And bilateral donors did this also, by the way. I mean, the Germans, for instance, they would send fantastic people to the DRC, and I'm still grateful to them because they managed to work with these secretariats and, of course, shape them to some extent in accordance to their own policy instructions, their own guidelines you get from the Germans. Say, let's try to get a lot of copper to the Metallgesellschaft or something like that, So I mean, in a way, this is the art of doing business in civil society, that you have to balance many different influences and try to get something creative out of it. And I think EITI is an example of how this can work very well. And I hope they will survive their present crisis, which has partly, arisen because they perhaps are going too fast for many of the companies. Companies may drop out and say we are not participating anymore. The other issue is, which has not been raised by you yet, is that we rely very much at EITI on a very constructive role of the Publish What You Pay initiative. The Publish What You Pay initiative, as I said, was in the beginning our starting group. They have about 400 members now, if not more. And we rely on them to some extent to select the candidates for election of the board. I mean, the three constituencies under the charter of EITI have the same voting power. I think this is a rather interesting invention of myself, where basically you have, at the time we had 55 or so companies participating, so they had 55 votes. But we had about 400 civil society organizations. So we said under the charter, they have 55 votes. And then we had about, at the time, perhaps 38 governments participating. They got 55 votes. And so they elect together the board, they pass the policy resolutions in the membership meetings. They decide on the budget, on hiring and firing of people in the secretariat with this voting system. But the group of civil society organizations was a rather unwieldy group. I mean, some of them are pretty confrontational. They would like to throw bricks through the windows of McDonald's or something like that, or chain themselves to the factory doors of the mining companies, while others were more sort of technocratic, like TI, which is trying to professionally address corruption issues. And so we relied very much, and we still do, on the Publish What You Pay coalition to make decisions ahead of the board meetings. And so very often, therefore, there is already a decision which the members of the civil society on the board will take together. It makes it very hard for the chair to have an open discussion, because they more or less have a Beschlusslage, as we call it in Germany. So they have been told, we are going to vote against this person or against that, and so on. And since we had a system of unanimity, I mean, I had perhaps 3 or 4 voting situations where we counted the votes, but most of the cases was always on consensus. It is very difficult to overcome a predetermined decision of this publish what you pay initiative. And therefore in Peru, in the membership meeting last year, a couple of civil society organizations felt that they didn't get enough weight with their ideas in general. So they didn't want to accept the authority and the usefulness of the publish what you pay community. And I think this is not yet fully resolved, this issue. In fact, George Soros was a great funder of the Publish What You Pay initiative. In fact, he sometimes would finance meetings, where they all had 2 days of meetings or so ahead of our board meeting. So it was then very often not so easy to overcome a combined position of civil society representatives on my board. I didn't mind because I am civil society myself, but sometimes the representatives of the private sector, for instance, they objected to that, and therefore they began to also caucus before the meeting. So, for instance, the mining companies are represented by the International Council for Minerals and Mining in London, which is very similar to what the Publish What You Pay initiative has done. So it is a very interesting organization, and but it has produced fantastic results, and I'm very proud of it. And I think we will have this summer. We will have our membership meeting in Berlin with EITI. What is fascinating is that some of the rich countries are now also participating. I mean, Norway participated from the very beginning. As in general, they are the great heroes in this whole exercise. But the Germans always said, "Oh, we don't need this, our companies, they report fully what they pay in taxes and so on, so we don't have to go through this exercise." And but now they changed, and they created a very good multi-stakeholder working group, reporting with a lot of support from the government, and because the government has begun to understand that they themselves are, to some extent, the victims of tax evasion and so on of these companies. So this summer will be an interesting meeting in Germany, and maybe some of you should offer your help in organizing the meeting to the Secretariat in Oslo, and rub shoulders with the people coming from everywhere to Berlin in order to celebrate the 15th anniversary of EITI.
Great, thank you. We are actually almost, oh no, we are out of time, but I think we have 2 more questions. So can we have those questions briefly, which I think relate in some ways a little bit. It's more about evaluation now.
Hi.
Who is hi?
Hello. My name is Akleo from Uganda, and this is my question. EITI, to some extent, has achieved its short-term goals, like improved revenue management, but however, corruption among extraction companies still remains high. What are the possible existing strategies and measures like to address this problem?
Did you understand that?
Yeah, I think basically that in many ways as an organization and as from a management perspective, EIT has gone a long way, but corruption in many countries remains still a pretty big problem. I think this is from one of the evaluations that we read. And so where does the future, how can we be even more successful than EIT already was or is?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel there are so many successes in fighting corruption, and for me the greatest success is the OECD Convention Against Fraud and Bribery, where many countries are prosecuting their companies when they bribe. I mean, in Germany, for instance, we have about 120 companies which are being prosecuted, while in the past they would get a tax write-off as a reward for bribing decision makers in Africa and Latin America and Asia and so on. So there are great successes, But the corrupt people are also very good in developing their own ways, which we haven't understood yet. So while we have now improved legislation in some areas and so on, there are a lot of tricks which are being used by big companies. Particularly the most difficult thing we are facing right now is the question of the anonymity of beneficial ownership. I mean, if you're in Uganda, for instance, you have a company which produces tobacco. I remember we once financed a tobacco project in Uganda in the World Bank. And but they sell it to themselves, to a company registered in the Bahamas, but nobody knows that it's the same company. And so we are not really surprised about the very low price they charge. We are surprised that the producing company in Uganda has no profits at all, has only losses, And therefore they pay no taxes, they pay no dividends, they pay no royalties, because it's such a loss-making organization. Because they sell everything at a very low price to themselves, in the Bahamas. Then it's very hard for the Ugandan government, even with an experienced and long-time president like Museveni, to discover that he's being cheated, that people are stealing from the people of Uganda. And this is one of the big issues, is the unknown ownership relationships of companies, in particular big resource buyers like Trafigura or Glencore and so on, sitting in Switzerland, privately held companies which don't report to any stock exchange and so on. And they go around and buy, and nobody knows to whom they basically sell the raw material. So there are many, many tricks which are still open. This is why it's so important, in my opinion, to work with the private sector, to work with the governments. I mean, I have been criticized when we worked with Siemens. They said these guys are just using you as a fig leaf. And I said, I think fig leaves are okay as long as they are transparent. So we basically used Siemens. I mean, people say that Siemens used us in order to shield themselves from criticism. No, we used them. They wrote this open letter, which I mentioned earlier, they signed this, to Helmut Kohl, asking for participation at the OECD convention. And then later they were caught by the rules which society was able to establish against foreign bribery, and they had to pay $2 billion in lawyers' fees and fines and so on. So I have the feeling that EITI has made a tremendous difference in Nigeria, for instance, tremendous difference in uncovering corruption. But if you have a president like Goodluck Jonathan, so who doesn't care, who doesn't prosecute corruption, then the transparency which is created there doesn't really help anybody. So the question is, how quickly do we have to have successes in order to be credible, in order to be supported by the people who want to fight corruption? And I agree with you, it's very hard. It's a long fight, I mean, Mr. Rosindana, for instance, he has been with us from the very beginning, 25 years. He's still fighting. But Mr. Museveni has been there even longer. So the question is, how successful can you be? In Kenya, I mean, we had Kibaki elected on an anti-corruption campaign. He made the head of the TI chapter, John Githongo, his permanent secretary to fight corruption. And after a couple of years, John Githongo had to run away from Kenya because the new corrupt group of people surrounding Kibaki reverted back to corruption. And the people of Kenya are now paying the price for it, or have paid the price when so many people died in connection with the elections, with corrupt elections 10 years ago. So we have to fight. I think we are making progress. I think we are making tremendous progress. But and EITI is making tremendous progress. But I think we need people like you to join civil society, but with tremendous skills, with tremendous professionalism, with persistence, with strong value system, and this way we can win.
Peter, on that note of I think that was the last question. Even if it weren't, we have to, because we have to go somewhere else. But on that note of progress, but also persistence, I personally, I think, but in all the name of you, I can't thank you enough for spending this time. We have overtime. We could go on for many more hours. Thank you so much. I have a little gift from our students as a memorabilia, our infamous SPP bag, all signed by them as a sign of your gratitude. So for shopping in Berlin or wherever you are in the world, you can take that with you and advertise the school as well as and something else. But let me thank you very much for